Hello, this is John with Coins, RPGs, and more. And today will be a review of another one of my favorite systems. This system is within the Swords and Wizardry system family, and it is Swords and Wizardry WhiteBox. Swords and Wizardry WhiteBox is written by Marv Bragg. And I will not read all of the other editing and art credits because there are many. But the cover is by Peter Mullen, and the back cover is by Christopher Burdett. If I have mispronounced your names, I do apologize. Please let me know. So there's the cover, and here's the back cover. Let's get into the system itself. It's it's a retro clone. It's part of the old school Renaissance group of games. And as such, it sticks to a lot of the very familiar formulas we're already familiar with. One of the things that it does well is the modifiers to ability scores. In my opinion, this is very good. Anything below a 6, or anything a 6 or lower in your ability scores, gives you a -1 to that roll, or -5% to a percentage chance. Anything a 15 or higher gets you a +1 to that roll, or a +5%. What that means is that if you've got a character with an 18 in one score, they still only get a +1 or a +5%. Now, the reason why I think this is a great feature is it gives the people who rolled really well for their characters, random number generation, an oomph. They get an edge. But they don't get so much of an edge that you feel your character isn't playable if you don't have that edge. That's one thing that I hear a lot in later editions of the world's most famous role-playing game is, oh, I don't have at least 118, this character isn't playable, or my scores are, terrible because highest thing I have is a 12. And I don't like that mindset, because to me, what makes a character playable and interesting is not necessarily high stats all the time. The high stats are nice. They're a great treat. They allow you to do fun things. But what makes a character memorable is the low stats, their flaws. That's the difference between a character and a game piece. A game piece has no flaws. You move it around the board, you do fun things with it, and then, with luck, you win the game. But if you're making a character, characters tend to be defined more by their flaws than by their special abilities. And that's a good way to look at it in fiction as well as in our games. So I want people to have low scores, not because I'm a cruel GM or you can't do well in my game, ha ha ha. No, it's because I want you to think, how can I make this bad ability score fit into an actual flaw for my character? And then how can I turn that flaw into role-playing opportunities? Because a character who's perfect at everything, why are they an adventurer? Why are they out there risking their life? Because they're great. They could be ruling the town. They could be leading an army. They could be out there being the best group leader and hero that you've ever heard of. They don't need to be in this dark, dank dungeon because they're already great. But they are in the dark, dank dungeon. And I think that has a lot to do with character flaws. And so I think that's a great part about a system like this and other systems that use a similar ability score piece. It's one of the big highlights of these lighter white box systems is your high scores are cool, but they don't stop you from playing. Low scores, but they're not going to make, if you feel like your character's unplayable because the negative modifiers don't keep adding up, the positive modifiers don't keep adding up. It's just a little oomph to give you something and you're moving on. Just like we're going to move on right now. Now, there are the 4 primary classes: fighter, magic user, rogue or thief, and and cleric. Now, in WhiteBox, classes only go up to level 10. The mindset being that once you get to level 10, that's typically where our characters are going to start wanting to do things like starting running strongholds, becoming nobility, and leaving the adventurer life to sort of retire or change their focus. So that's a good ending point for a campaign if you want your campaign to be about just traveling, finding things, and solving problems. Now, if you want to have that higher level campaign that deals with a lot of that more realm-based adventuring ideas, then actually Swords and Wizardry Complete is going to have you covered. And I'll go over that in a later review and a later talk about what I like and don't like about games. So, aside from that, there really isn't there's a lot of differences between this and Continual Light in the content. This has more content. This has more explanations about things. This is the kind of book that you could, someone who's new to gaming could buy this book, and it's on sale in Lulu, if you're familiar with that website. I think they have one on drive-thru as well. I'll have to double check. This is a more detailed game than Continual Light. This has much more. There's more spells, for example. Each level of spells has at least 2 more spells added to it, and each of the spells is a little more detailed. This gives you the experience points for each class, so it's presuming that you're going to do wealth by gold pieces recovered from the dungeon, and there's a few other assumed rules. One of the other assumed things in this is that, let me try to bring this in here. Okay. So, races in this game, or ancestry, if you prefer that term. This book was written fairly early on during the OSR period, as far as I'm aware, so they still use the term race. This is different than some retro clones because they give the races as a separate entity, so you can make a dwarf or an elf who is of various classes. But they still limit what each ancestry can be. So the elf is really elves. They tend to only be able to be fighters, magic users, or thieves, and they're limited by how many levels they can attain in those things. They're limited by how many, or they also have the ability to, I believe it's dual classing is what it's called, when you're raising, or when you're going up as 2 classes at the same time. That's something that's unique to elves. No other ancestry has that option in the game. Now, this is an interesting feature in older OSR games because it tries to emulate what people saw in fantasy fiction, which is the elves were always a magical people who were pretty good at fighting, pretty good at magic, but there was seen as a need to balance that when creating a role-playing game so that the elves weren't automatically just better at everything than everyone else and therefore why would you ever be anything except an elf? They needed to answer that. And so that's why they imposed these limitations. And I think I see where they're coming from. From a game standpoint, it makes sense to pose a limitation. However, we've developed our understanding of cultures and ancestries and things like this beyond that at this point, where I don't really think such limitations actually serve a purpose. The other aspect that I see in this is, unless you're deliberately starting a game up at a higher level, most of the time your campaign isn't going to last long enough to actually get to the point where that elf is not going to be able to advance any further, or that dwarf is not going to be able to advance any further in their chosen class. Some people might, and that's awesome, and I have a lot of respect for you. If you can keep your campaign together that long, good on you. You're awesome. But I think for the most part, taking that part out of the game, which some clones have started to do, and I am a fan of personally, I think that's okay. So it's a point of this book that's kind of here nor it's neither really here nor there. I ignore it. You can ignore it, but it's present for those who like it. Now, this is something. This is cool. So that picture right there. When I first got into role playing, there was a photocopied book that someone had donated to my local library. I mean, now I look back at it, it's like this was an illegal photocopy because there was only one side of each page that had text on it and all this other stuff. And it was of the old, I think it was the old Holmes Basics set, if I remember correctly. But it's so long ago, I don't remember. I borrowed that from my library so many times. I think there was probably like 4 or 5 different times where I was the only one borrowing that book, and I'd borrow it over and over and over and over again because I was enjoying reading it. I just had a lot of fun. And that picture, that lizard person riding a lizard, looking towards the adventurers on the horizon, I mean, to me, that's what spoke to D&D. So on a personal note, seeing that in this book is one reason why I love this book. Now, that's entirely emotional and subjective, so, your mileage may totally vary, but I love it. All right, but let's get back to some of the more interesting parts. There have been plenty of reviews done of this before, so I don't really feel like I need to cover all aspects of this game. It's an OSR game. Damage is by d6s, so small weapons do d6 minus 1, medium weapons do d6, and large weapons do d6 plus 1. There's lots of spells. They're all relatively simple, more complex than you see in, say, games like Continual Light or Swords and Wizardry Light, but not quite as complex as you would get in advanced D&D or 2nd edition D&D or 3rd edition D&D or 4th and 5th. It goes on. So the spells are not nearly as complicated. There's lots of them. There's a whole bestiary in this book, lots of monsters, and there's magic items in here. There's cursed items in here. There's a lot of information that you can use to get your game off the ground. I've used this for running small dungeon crawls. I've used this for inspiration when running other games. Like when I'm running a Sword and Wizardry Continual Light game, I still have this book close to hand to get me ideas for other things to add if I can't find what I'm looking for in Continual Light. It's an extra reference that's still close enough in material that a lot of pieces are compatible. As for using it as someone with a visual impairment, when I bought this book, I got 2 copies of it. I want to say it was about maybe 7 years ago, 6 years ago, something like that. I bought 2 copies. One of the main reasons being I took 1 copy and I had a printer remove the spine or the binding here on the spine and then give it a spiral binding so that I could just flip it open and have it stay open. Now, I don't have that copy handy here. Let's see. Yeah, it's not handy here on my shelf for me to show you, but it has been my go-to. This one's been a little nicer. It's been sitting on my shelf as kind of my pristine copy. Now, I fell in love with the formatting of this book. And here's why. There's nothing complicated. All right? All the tables, there's plenty of room on them. Nothing is squished together. When it comes to text, even though it's a digest size, the size of the text is still pretty large, and a box that has text inside of it is not tinted. It simply has a border around it to delineate that this is separate. This is a box text. But there's no gray tint. And I love that because I can read it. And I love being able to read what authors have to write. It's amazing. So I love the way this book is done. It does all the fun things that a lot of other books do, but it does it in a very clean and crisp fashion so that I can get on with reading it and not have to spend even a couple of seconds trying to discern what is being said in error. So as far as for someone with a visual impairment, even if your eyes aren't quite as good as they used to be, or if you're like me and you're legally blind, but you still got a good amount of vision, so you can still read a book. This book is awesome and highly recommended on that umbrella. Now, it's also a one complete system. You don't need anything else to run a game. Just this book, dice, paper, and friends. And if you are a solo gamer, you don't even need friends. I'm just kidding. You always need friends. Friends are great. So that's my basic rundown of this one, real fast. It's great. It's simple. It's more robust than some other systems that I've used, but it's much less complicated than other systems. And I have bought a lot of supplements for this system. James Spawn has done several supplements, one of the main ones being WhiteBox Omnibus, that I quickly purchased the moment that it was made available I could get it on print on demand. This is on Drive-Thru RPG. What's in here is awesome. It expands the WhiteBox out to the point where I have more class options for this game than I do for the more recent edition of the game, and I love that. I think that's fantastic. So, and there's enough guidance here where if I don't have it, I feel comfortable that I can make it, and it won't break the game as long as I use these things as guidelines. So, WhiteBox is fantastic. Shout out to James Spawn. Your stuff is amazing. I purchased all of it, and I may end up making my own print copies of the ones you haven't put into omnibuses like this because they're great, and I want you to make more if you can, or put it all into one big omnibus that you're willing to sell on RPG or Drive-Thru RPG, and I'll buy it. I'm sure other people will too. If not, I'll just make one. But anyway, great stuff, good system, very readable, very easy to understand. Not a whole lot of complexity to it, but just enough to give you that nous so that you can have a cool and interesting game, but let the rules get out of the way so that you can tell the stories with your friends that you want to tell, because the stories are why we're here. that's my review. How I feel about this game, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you for stopping by. Peace be with you. Bye-bye.